He wanted me to see his gin palace. And I thought gin palace, wow, I had visions of like a palace that made gin. But we went to Girvan, Scotland, and it was literally a garage with these two ancient stills, a Carter and a Bennett still. And they were from the 1840s. At least one of them was. And I just thought to myself instantly, like, oh, wow, that looks like Jules Verne, like Captain Nemo stuff, right?
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of Decoding Cocktails. I'm Chris LeBeau, and I am loving right now that so often when I'm trying to put together a little recap of these episodes that I'm just like, what do I even say about this person or this guest? My guest today is Steve Grasse. He is the founder of an agency, and I'm sure that he would deplore that I'm even using the term agency because he's the agency is called Quaker City Mercantile. But Steve is very decidedly punk rock in his approach, and I think a lot of the things that you would associate with something like a marketing or an advertising agency, he would very much bristle at being associated with any of that. So who is he? Why did we come together to talk? Well, through his work, he's created a couple of brands. Some of them you may have even heard of. Fistful of Bourbon, maybe. Sailor Jerry Rum, probably. And the iconic Hendrick's Gin, all kind of fall under Steve's umbrella. He's also been involved with the rebirth of brands like Miller High Life, Pilsner Urquell, and another one, what's it called? Oh yeah, Guinness. So Steve, in addition to all of his work, has his own distillery. And something you're going to hear him say, but it's just too good to pass up, is he said, there's probably a poster on the wall of the TTB with our pictures on it that calls us the most annoying distillery in America because we're constantly looking for ways around the rules that they have. And for those of you that don't know, the TTB is the government agency that oversees much of the alcohol industry. He is also the author of Brand Mysticism, Cultivate Creativity, and Intoxicate Your Audience. And so we in part came together to talk about his book because he really went to the trouble to document his journey. Not so much a how-to book, but his reflections on what got him there. And like I mentioned, Steve's attitude is very decidedly punk rock, but he is also very enchanted by all things kind of, I shouldn't say all things, but, one of the things he really drives home during this is that trends are something that he feels like are a waste of time to often look at when you're studying a business because everybody else is looking at those exact same trends. So he's like, if you're getting all of your information off of TikTok and Instagram and following what's trending, well, then your creative inspirations are going to come from exactly the same places as everybody else's, and you're probably going to end up creating something that's not as interesting. And so, if at all, when I mentioned that Steve had created Hendrick's along with the company William Grant and Sons, that if you're like, wait, Hendrick's has been around for, one of the things Steve talks about is that you want a brand to be so complex in its creation that people will look at you and be like, there's no way. How could you have created Hendrick's? It's been around for 150 years. I'm sure of it. When in reality, it has not. When something is so complex, it really adds intrigue. And this is one of the other things that is really at the core of his piece is that magic and enchantment are these things that we value and yet are often very in short supply. And so how can brands step in a very genuine way and create these things? So, I mean, I wish there were other things I could do justice to. You should look up Steve's agency, Quaker City Mercantile. There'll be a link to it. Also, he is very quick in the book to point out that he's not regularly on social media, yet you'll hear me many times say that he's probably never on it. That's not true. If you want, you can follow him on Instagram at Stephen Grasse, Grasse. Again, there'll be a link for that in there. But his level of creativity and approach is just fantastic. I think you guys are going to love what he has to say. And there'll also be a link, of course, to his book as well. So with that, my conversation with Steve Grasse. Stephen, thanks so much for taking some time to chat today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
You betcha. You betcha. So, I mean, the first off, what I'll say about this is I appreciated what this book wasn't in a way because I am a former business guy. I'm not an MBA, but I read the hell out of a lot of business books growing up, and I appreciated it really being just a reflection on that because yeah, as opposed to just a how-to manual, it's how you've gotten to where you are. And so I also appreciated the no holds barred tone of the book too.
Well,
Made it
I hate business books. I make a point of never reading business books. I mentioned that in the book that I don't read business books. I read history books and biographies because I feel like that's a lot more to learn there. So the idea of writing this book, this was my COVID project. Um, and I teamed up with Aaron Goldfarb, who had done an article about how to make a booze brand go viral. It was all about Sailor Jerry. And we got along so well. I was like, I thought I'd contact him. And he instantly said yes. And we decided to do this. And luckily, our publisher, Running Press, who we've, this is my second book with Running Press. We have a third book coming out with Running Press in the May of next, I think in the spring. It's another cocktail book. So this one was I think a gamble for Running Press to do a non-cocktail book with me, and I'm glad they took the chance.
Yeah. So a thing, I guess, a place. There are so many places to start based on everything you wrote, but there was a passage that I loved. I kind of wanted to read for people and kind of turn you loose, hopefully from there. Which, by the way, I'll preface with the book you reference here. I went out and bought immediately. So you talk about "As If" by Michael Saylor, and
Yeah,
you say the basic gist is that the Enlightenment and later Industrial Revolution killed the magic and enchantment in the world. It turns
yeah,
out that these two things are necessary for the human experience. We yearn for them, we strive for them, we need them. But you go on to talk about that the Enlightenment and Revolution really they killed God, and so they took away a lot of the mysticism. And this seems like such a core tenet when you're talking about Jules Verne and Zeppelin, that there is this whole mysticism here. And so, one, I loved this enchantment and enchantment piece that you created. Um, but for people out there that haven't read the book yet, how do you
mhm.
begin to tackle this? Because obviously you spent 200 pages or 180 pages talking about it here. So, anyways, I loved that passage.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because the book kind of rambles to and fro, but that's really the gist of the core idea in the book is that enchantment and mysticism were destroyed by the Enlightenment, which is a pretty radical view. But I would also venture to say that the Enlightenment also killed the planet with global warming. But we promised we weren't going to talk about politics, but that's not really politics. Um, so I feel like it's interesting because I guess at the core of it, I'm a very spiritual person, and I feel that uh, science. we've become very rational. Okay. And when we're
Mm-hmm.
rational, we kill a lot of possibility and a lot of nuance. And the stuff that makes up good stories. So, I hate using the term marketer or advertising person because I think there was a great book I read once. It said, "Don't tell my mother I work in advertising. She thinks I play piano in a whorehouse." Um, which I thought was funny because I have massive contempt for the advertising industry and marketing. Um, but it's at the heart of it. I'm a I hate the word storyteller too because it's become so
Right.
overused. But
Right.
I I if you look at what makes a story stick, it's the depth or the level of the nuance in the storytelling. And the book you're talking about, As If, which is, it's funny. Did you actually buy the book,
Oh
As
yeah.
If?
Oh yeah. It's en route.
It's oh okay. It's really it's a brilliant book, but it's a tough read. I think it's like Oxford University Press or something, and it's deeply intellectual. But the basic gist of it is that when the Industrial Revolution killed God and killed magic and enchantment in the world, that people started creating it for themselves. And the first creator of this was probably Jules Verne, when he created, the book's all about like the first forays into virtual reality. But virtual reality in the context of this was, Verne would create maps and
Yeah.
a whole language and then obviously, you know, Sherlock Holmes was an example of this, and then later on Tolkien and Lovecraft, and the idea that when the stories of lore and magic and mystical qualities um, are no longer in our culture, we create them,
Mm-hmm.
and those ideas are what I've used to build the brands that I've become quite known for. In particular, I would say the best example of that is Hendrick's Gin.
Right.
Um, and at the heart of it too, it's what makes Star Wars work. It's what makes you know all the Marvel, all that crap. But it's like at the heart of it, that's what we're doing is we're recreating myths and mythologies and mystical qualities, because they've been destroyed by mass culture and the Enlightenment, which is puts the rational before the mystical. So
Yeah. And
yeah, it's some deep shit. It's really interesting because you think like, oh, it's a book on how to create a brand. No, it's not. It's really a book on how to create new worlds and why it's important too. It's not just I want to create a brand and make $1 billion. It's like it's a guidebook for your whole life because these mystical and enchantment qualities are so important to your overall being, not just to your career.
yeah. And I definitely, think you raise that well with terms like, oh, I think about new brands as like a garage band, or you talked about it in terms of like this is very cult like in a very healthy way, right? It's moving to an interesting fringe as opposed to the boring middle, and all that resonates with me from marketer who shirks the term advertising. Seth Godin talks about that a lot too, in terms of cultivating, kind of a tribe, a cult, finding the people who are following a very specific. And another thing that I love too is, I like to say it's like, one day the Instagram reels and all this, and I know you're a huge fan of social media, are, they're all going to be, they're everything's getting faster. And your response has been, let's go deeper, like
Yeah,
creating for Hendrix this, if I may, unnecessary field book that's like 80 pages long or whatever, that is detailing out all the intricacies of everything going on there. And I think it's so counterintuitive that we yearn for this depth, but we do. It's just there's all this pressure to go faster right now. We all want to keep up with the trend of faster.
Yeah, bigger, better, faster, more. Or what's the Who album? Meaty, beady, big, and bouncy. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if my approach works for everything. Like, I don't know if it works for Tide laundry detergent, but I
Sure.
think it would. Why wouldn't it? Um, but I think for high engagement products like alcohol, where it's the stories of how it's categories with really interesting backstories, or the whole idea that alcohol was created by the alchemists, um thousands of years ago. It's like you're just starting from this point of depth and intrigue, and it's just really fun when you create it. It's interesting. I before I worked in the spirits industry, I worked in the tobacco industry. um and what I thought what was really interesting about the tobacco industry is how it destroyed itself, and how tobacco, which it's now regulated and it should be, but
Right.
back in the day when I did it, it wasn't. And there were things like, there are more different kinds of tobacco plants than there are grapes, right? And yet the tobacco industry destroyed itself by selling itself as a commodity, as
Right.
opposed to talking about the nuance of the different types of tobacco and the experience of flavor and things like that. And what was interesting about I created Sailor Jerry rum as a hobby, and that hobby ended up becoming this massive brand that we sold. Um, but I thought what was great about the spirits industry is I liked that it had those stories and that depth of authenticity and meaning, but they hadn't it hadn't destroyed itself. Well, I guess it probably did during the what do you call it, prohibition, but it had
Yes.
already been regulation, right? So I guess long story short is alcohol is a great category to work in because people don't hate you for it. And there's a lot of brand loyalty. Like we always say, like if you do it right, if you create a great spirits brand, it'll go for 100 years.
Sure.
And so going back to what you were saying about, I talk a lot about bands in the book, and it's interesting because my background, and the reason in the book we go through this whole like meandering, the start of the company and how we grew and then eventually ended up in the spirits businesses is a very informal garage punk kind of background that we didn't know what we were doing. I never worked for a big agency. We just started this thing, and we always based it on the idea that I was just always intrigued when I was I was growing up. Like you would like write the name of your favorite. You write Metallica on your notebook, and you would carve it into your locker or whatever. But you never do that with brands.
Right.
So what makes a band so sticky and so why are people so passionate about that? Um, and so we've always really built our brands thinking like the way a band would create. And if you think about like a big influence of mine has always been Malcolm McLaren, who was the I guess he created the Sex Pistols, Bow Wow Wow, Adam and the Ants. But he was the maestro behind this behind those bands. He kind of really created the visual idea, and but the thing about bands that's really interesting is, and this is a big theme in the book, is bands don't create albums with focus groups. Maybe they do these days, but the bands I like don't create albums based on focus groups. They create them based on passion points or things that are interesting to them.
Right.
And what they do that's really exciting is they kind of smush these ideas together in a really like what seems to be a nonsensical, incoherent way, but it's like a crazy chef who's putting these crazy ingredients together, but yet after he puts it in the oven, it comes out and it's like delicious. So I talk a lot in the book about Led Zeppelin and
Yeah,
like how
yeah,
they're
yeah.
on one hand they're into like they mix Mississippi blues with Tolkien, right?
Yep.
Makes no fucking sense, but it's like but it's brilliant, right? And that's the way we've always looked at our brands is we create in this sort of illogical stream of consciousness way that's influenced by, because again, the other thing we talk a lot about in the book is like just turn off the social media and read old books, read long books, read them entirely. Don't
Mm-hmm.
skim, go through, because that's where the ideas are that nobody else has tapped.
Right.
That's where your ideas are, and it's about how you put things, how you make connections between different ideas that you have. And if the only ideas you have are from Instagram Reels or TikTok, that's the extent or the depth of the idea, or that's all you're going to come up with. But if you've been, I'm just finishing up War and Peace,
Okay.
um, and I also have just started reading this great book about the Little Ice Age that started from 1590 to 1680,
Okay.
all about how um, for some they don't get into the reason why the climate changed and became like um, you know like literal an ice age for 100 years. They don't get into why, but they get into the impact it had on everything. Like a great fact was you know people always drank wine before this. You had to drink wine, you couldn't drink water because it would kill you, but they drank wine. But during the mini ice age, all the vines died, all of them. So that's when people really started drinking beer.
Mm.
Fascinating. I
Yep.
wouldn't know. I hadn't read this book. So that's the way we create. It's a very unique process. And in the book, we kind of break it down how we do it. But and my process is not going to be yours, or my interests aren't going to be yours. But out of the process comes things that are genuinely unique and are not like riffing off a current trend. Instead, they're like really weird. Like Hendrix was the weirdest thing that ever had ever happened in the gin category when we came up with it. I think 24 years ago. Nothing was ever like it, and that's why 24 years later, it's like I think we're the third biggest gin in the world, and just we're growing double digits every year for the last 24 years because it's truly unique and different, and you know went on to redefine the whole category.
And you talk about just that before Hendrix, as an example, that like, hey, people might have drank Beefeater or Tanqueray and liked it, but nobody really talked about it this way. And I think, that's this pursuit of scale and the middle you come back to where you're talking about at one point the little street concerts that you would have for Sailor Jerry.
Yeah,
And I think you had the example of like, we can't, even if she wanted to come, we can't invite Taylor Swift. That's a huge impression for us. It's going to, I mean, you will be everywhere, but that is diluting the brand. And I think you spend time talking about that in terms of people either never establish that depth or, what's it? Use the example of like, oh, that Starbucks is a Moby Dick reference. And then you go, did anybody know that? I didn't know that. So yeah, I
yeah.
think brands, it's you go on to say like, hey, like, I mean, you always need to get weirder and more in depth. And obviously maybe that doesn't apply for everything, but I appreciated it because it feels like it's all about faster, more impressions, what's on trend, as opposed to how do you stay true to yourself once you kind of really establish that those passion points that you referenced, like with like
Well,
Zeppelin.
and what's interesting is, again, in the spirits category, you tend to have a little more time to do that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm selling bars of soap, um, or if I've got some VC who wants his investment back, you've got to go a little faster. However, I think it's really important to know that when you're creating a brand, if you don't bake these things into the brand, your success will be fleeting. So it's
Mm-hmm.
the idea that We call it in the it's called we call it our onion method. And the
Mm-hmm.
idea with the onion is that there's layers of meaning. And with a lot of brands, if you go scratch the surface, there's not much underneath the surface. But with our brands, the more layers you unpeel, the more interesting it gets, not less interesting it gets. And those things that you're like, well, yeah, it doesn't matter. Do you really have to do all this to go to this extent? It's like, you have to do it for the super fans. You also have to do it for the people that you've paid to help create the stuff with you because they lose interest otherwise. Everyone loses interest unless you keep the story fresh. And who does it well? Disney, Star Wars. It's like Marvel. Like, although I hate those things, but and it's another really good reference we always talk about is The Simpsons.
Yep. Yep.
And what's interesting about The Simpsons, so with Hendrix, we've created hundreds of characters over the years, like Birdman, all these like crazy characters, and we have names for all of them. We know we have profiles for all of them,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very similar to like with the Simpsons. Over the longevity of the brand and is the full realization of Springfield and the backstories and it's just goes to an illogical extent, and that's to bring up your first point. What we're talking about with like Jules Verne was the first to do that. And it's interesting because Jules Verne was the inspiration for Hendrix for me. Um, and just give an idea of like what the stream of consciousness that we go through when we create. The story with Hendrix is, uh, you know, okay, so back in the day, our company is called Gyro. Now it's called Quaker City Mercantile. But Gyro, our biggest client was R.J. Reynolds Tobacco that dominated everything we did. And then we had two other clients. We had uh, Puma sneakers globally.
Mm-hmm.
But back in the day when we first started working with Puma, they were a $30 million brand. We ended our tenure with them when they sold it to Gucci for $7 billion. Um, and then our other client was William Grant and Sons, and which makes Glenfiddich. And our first job for them was to do a U.S. campaign for Glenfiddich whiskey. And they asked us, we don't have a gin or a rum in our portfolio. Can you help us create something? So we came back to them with two ideas. One was Hendrick's Gin, and the other one was Sailor Jerry Rum. So I had started a clothing company called Sailor Jerry because somebody who worked for me was this like heavily tattooed guy who, you know, always talked about Sailor Jerry. And so we researched it, found ended up buying the Sailor Jerry estate for I think $10,000, which basically was his name and his artwork. Um, but regarding going back to the gin, when we did, I didn't know anything about gin. Sir Charles Gordon Grant, who was the not the founder of William Grant and Sons, but he was the guy who ran it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I went to Scotland with him. He wanted me to see his gin palace, and I thought gin palace. Wow, I had visions of like a palace that made gin, but we went to Girvan, Scotland, and it was literally a garage with these two ancient stills, a Carter and a Bennett still, and they were from the 1840s. At least one of them was. And I just thought to myself instantly, like wow, that looks like Jules Verne, like Captain Nemo stuff, right? And and then when we started talking about how gin was made and the gin basket and how you could put different botanicals in it, I just got this sense of Victorian apothecary. And so I sent my assistant Rona to antique stores, and she found a old poison bottle. And we just blew that up to a 750 ml size, and that's the Hendrix bottle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it was, and then the brand world we created was kind of felt like Monty Python cutouts, and that was, economic reasons. There was no budget, and also feeding into the Victorian apothecary and the Jules Verne vibe. So it's this whole stream of consciousness that it's also like the Big Bang Theory, because the way we come up with brands is everything happens all at once. Um, the bottle, the brand world, the idea for everything sort of occurs all at once, and it kind of all fits together. And it took me years to realize that's not the way most agencies or companies work. Because we would, if we worked for somebody other than grants, and they would ask us to create something, we would say, well, they would say, okay, you do this part, then we're going to have a packaging agency do this part, and then we're going to hand it over to a marketing agency. We're like, no, we do it. We do the whole thing, or we don't do it at all. And there was always like, well, what do you mean you do the whole thing? I'm like, well, how do you not do the whole thing? Like, it's all one idea. And I guess I don't know. So, man, I'm talking a lot. Go ahead.
That's why this conversation is happening, to hear to mine your brain a little bit.
Yeah.
So I mean, maybe uh your your playbook isn't necessarily my playbook in this
Yeah.
world. But so I really have started to, like, I have like it written down upstairs right now. If I was a garage band, what would I be?
Yeah.
And, you talk incessantly, and part of this is the old books in terms of just general interest, but also like, you're like, if you're not cultivating curiosity, you're sunk. But are there, part of it's probably practice, but if you're kind of at the starting line of trying to envision yourself as a garage band or whatever, are there any suggestions of what to do, what to avoid? I mean, you have the steps in the book, but I guess I'm just curious if there's any general field advice you've had for people out there running their bar, running their brand, etc.
Well, yeah. I mean, keep going back to the band analogy. Like, why would anyone care? What are you about? Why is it interesting to, um, why is it interesting? Uh, so I think perspective, and that's why, again, going back to the, you know, not just reading old books, but having an idea of what interests you, of cultivating curiosity. So, um, you don't need to have like, if you have a theme that's so obvious, and maybe it's too obvious. Um, like I think, again, the bands that work really well are when it's like a not a mishmash, but like a mashup of different ideas that somehow becomes this coherent thought that only you could have had. Okay, so I mean, look at the Misfits band, the Misfits, right? So I mean, they're kind of inspired by, like, it's punk, but it's also 50s. Um, but it's also like horror movies. So how does that make any sense? But yet it becomes this very clear idea after you've put out enough expressions of that idea. If you've put out enough layers of the onion, the Misfits couldn't be anything else but the Misfits. Does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense?
It does. I mean, you know, I started my little venture around this idea of teaching my friends how to make drinks, and that's great. And cocktails, I think, should be a little bit more like cooking to the average person. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
I think you get a little comfort creating things. I think also, like, I love the arc that the chef Dan Barber put, which is like the strike against vodka and so many things, which is, that he talks about that in food, the pursuit of things should be flavor, and so I think that, when people should drink whatever they like. But I think it's like, oh, once you taste a rich, flavorful spirit, uh, or you taste a rich, flavorful cocktail, the idea of consuming six of something that has no flavor. But anyways, I feel like I'm still looking for that third or fourth piece of the Venn diagram in terms of why me, because everybody, I had, so I work on the side in the industry still right now. And so I was having a post shift drink last night and I had some fistful of bourbon. So,
Yeah.
but that was my first one. Very, very nicely done. But I was on your guys' website and I was like, damn easy cocktails. Cool. But it's like, okay, there's a big push for simplicity right now. So where does
Yeah.
that leave me in terms of what makes somebody want to come see my band when a lot of people are talking about easy cocktails right now? So yeah, this is just where my own thinking is in terms of my additional edge.
All right. So let's talk about mixology and all that. So first of all, I'm not a mixologist.
Sure.
I make the worst drinks in the world, which is really funny. People always like with in a place, people are like, "Oh, you make me a drink." I'm like, dude, I can't. It's funny. Since I opened my own distillery, I drink everything straight
Sure.
because I want to enjoy the spirit. But okay, you said an interesting point. So why cocktails? It's cooking. It's a culinary adventure. I laugh when you've got these cocktail snobs. You're like, well, classic recipes have to be done exactly to this. I'm like, do they? Like riff on it. But I also feel like there's so much you can do with mixology. The way we're trying to do things with our spirits, like we have this crazy line of spirits we're doing in New Hampshire called House of Tamworth, where we just made it went like crazy viral. The Crab Trapper whiskey, which was made with the invasive green crabs. Um, and I mean, it's funny. I think there probably is a poster on the wall of the TTB with our pictures on it being the most annoying distillery in America because we're constantly pushing them to give us a waiver or get around restrictions because we're always looking for new ingredients. So I feel like with the mixology world, it's like there's no reason why you can't brand yourself and be really adventuresome with what you're doing. I mean, quite frankly, I find cocktail books. I'm so shocked people buy them.
Sure.
It's like,
Yep.
how many ways can you? And it's funny because our latest cocktail book, the Cocktail Workshop from Martin the Age, it literally fits that mold of like, you know, here's three different variations on the old fashioned. But I feel like it's ripe to really go into a new direction. I don't know what that direction is because I'm not necessarily focused on it at this moment, but I would approach it the same way. I think people like um, we always say with when we create a brand, there's three ingredients, and they all have to happen at once, and they're all very interconnected, and they seem obvious, but it's like first of all you need a great liquid, and when I say a great liquid, I mean a differentiated liquid.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're just going to come out with another whiskey, like why bother? What are you doing that is unique? So with Hendrix, for instance, the rose and cucumber thing was truly differentiated. With Sailor Jerry, um, it was the first high proof spiced rum, so it was basic. It was simple. For a buck more, you get 92 proof, right? Um, so differentiated liquid, great packaging, which again it seems pretty obvious, but the packaging and then the third one is a great story. And the story and the packaging and the liquid, the packaging is the expression. It's the nucleus. It's the very heart of what the entire brand is. If you put Hendrix bottle in the middle of the Hendrix universe, it is literally the sun or the it's the nucleus around which everything revolves, and they all need to be interconnected. And again, most marketers don't think that way. They parcel it out to various different firms. We turned down this massive project, which I won't tell you who it was or what the product was, but we turned it down because the packaging had already been done. And they said, you can do everything else. I'm like, I can't. And they're like, um, do you realize what you're turning down? I'm like, sorry, but we just have to. I just can't. I don't like what you've done with the packaging, and I don't know how I can make that work. Um, because it needs to, it's all interconnected. And then again, I don't know why you couldn't do that with mixology and cocktails. And I don't think enough people are really pushing it far enough in that way. I would imagine. It's interesting. I've been seeing some of these thematic bars popping up that I don't know, the cocktail experience where they're trying to build in the storytelling with it. I can't give you specific examples off the top of my head, but it's interesting. But we've been to one of these things, and the storytelling was terrible, and the cocktails were even worse. But I thought it was an interesting idea of trying to create a universe around the cocktail experience. But what I've seen in this area has been pretty cheesy, so I don't know. I don't think anyone's really figured it out yet. But
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah, one, I think, with cocktails being, 10, 20 years behind cooking, we see a big thirst for them. We also see
yeah,
plenty of bad cocktails or bad experimentation, people just
yeah,
that are trying crazy things. And so hopefully it gets reined in a little bit. But yeah, I guess to your point, as I use this for my own little workshopping of my own brand, like when I'm in person teaching people, there is a level of passion, enthusiasm, you can do this attitude that comes out that I think is not conveyed as well through the packaging and the brand story. So I don't I have
yes,
I have struggled with how to synthesize the the experience people have into a broader brand, and I have not put the investment capital into that yet in terms of really bringing that to life. So
well,
that's
there's an interesting point I bring up in the book, which I would imagine is, not everyone's going to agree with, but I don't think taste is subjective. Good taste. I think that, um, if you look into, mystical properties of sacred geometry and, the golden ratio and all that stuff, like you can't really, because sometimes you're like, well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. It's like, no, I'm sorry, it's not. Like there is an aesthetic quality uh, that I think also extends to, flavor as well. So there's good examples and bad examples of fashion, architecture, design, and bad examples are just bad examples. So I think a lot of, like, if you say like somebody has enthusiasm and is creating, yeah, but is it any good? And I think
right.
you can judge it. Um, you can't just say, well, everyone to each their own. Like, no, no, sorry, it doesn't work that way. If you have put a lot of enthusiasm into something, but it's still bad, it's bad because you haven't done your homework, or you haven't done brought up your level of skill where you actually understand what is aesthetically working, or working on a culinary level. um and when something hits all the notes in the right way, uh it's usually rewarded because it finds an audience, because it naturally, it's like when a beautiful face or whatever, no one denies it, because it's just like, it just is, and it finds its audience.
Yeah, I did appreciate you talking about what you've and again, your personal outlook on what makes great packaging, but you talked about, oh, like, this is what makes Sailor Jerry's, because I think you used a punk rock example. You said into your world, it's like punk rock, and that was the Malcolm McLaren quote was
Yeah,
punk made ugly beautiful, right?
Yes,
But you talked about that some things are just bad versus Sailor Jerry was a little bit like bad
on purpose.
on purpose. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
we always say we make things ugly on purpose, and what we mean by that is, and it's funny because I think I rip on British design in the book,
Yep. Yep.
and what I don't mean to rip on British people, although I wrote a whole other book about the British people called Evil Empire. But what I mean is that when you make something trendy, it's instantly outdated the moment it comes out. Whereas if you make something that's authentic to what you're trying to create or authentic to the story, then it transcends time and transcends all trends. And then, so something like Hendrick's Gin, I've had people argue with me that there's no way you created that. It's been around for 100, since 1887. And I'm like, oh, then we did a good job because there's no way, in the original Sailor Jerry bottle, it's changed a bit, but the original Sailor Jerry bottle was designed to look like it sat on your grandfather's, man cave in the basement in 1973. I mean, that was the point. And if you do your brand like Narragansett beer, great ugly on purpose brand, right? Because it feels like it's working class Rhode Island, and that's what it is. And so a lot of British design is trying to win. This is why we also rail on award shows in the book, because I feel like when you create design for award shows, you're creating for your peers as opposed to serving the product or the project that you're trying to create. Same is true with the spirits award shows. We're not big fans. I'm not. We don't enter them because I'm like, I don't. I don't know. I just feel like it's a entire waste of resources and time, and I feel like let the people decide. Just put it out there and see if it works. And so we don't enter those. You know, although more power to you if you do, but I feel like there's better ways to. Um, the reason Sailor Jerry exists is when our biggest client was R.D. Reynolds Tobacco, they paid us in monopoly money, meaning that it was just like ridiculous. We were like, in our 20s and just like getting paid with like mountains of cash. But we couldn't enter our work in the advertising award shows because nobody wanted to know us. We were pariahs.
Mm.
So we said, let's take that money and let's create stuff. Let's make our own stuff. So one of the things we made was Sailor Jerry clothing company. Another thing we made was a uh, film series called Bikini Bandits. And then a third thing we made was a convenience store, which was like it was a fake convenience store called G Mart. And G Mart was like this, it was like an art project. It was a pop up, similar to the Prada store in Marfa, Texas, but we were first.
Mm-hmm.
Or what's the other one? The time travel store McSweeney's has.
Yeah.
Is that who has?
They,
We beat them out by 10 years, right? So we did those projects with our monopoly money, and one of them blew up massively, right? Um, but got news on Bikini Bandits. We signed a deal with a major Hollywood production house, and it looks like that's um, hopefully getting made into a docu series. But uh, but so I always feel too like I never give up on. I have a whole catalog of ideas and brands. We very well chronicle everything we do. We keep our trademarks intact, and if something dies, it will be reborn in another form because we just like we why not just it's intellectual property you created. Just find a way to make it work. If not now, at some point. So
yeah, Gmart sounded like quite a trip, so that's it's pretty cool. So knowing that we have just a little bit more time left, from just like knowing that it's obviously still fringe and cultish, but to this slightly different take on making ugly beautiful. you also talk towards the end of the book about Hermes quite a bit in terms of the
Yeah,
brand that they. So I'd love, just since people can think about that as like obviously ultra high end luxury. Do you
yeah.
mind talking for a minute about what you admire about how they've built their brand so people can think about it more from like a luxury end of things where you've said your mind kind of is right now?
Well, okay, so with the distillery in New Hampshire, what we're doing in a very audacious experiment is uh, instead of creating mass volume, and trying to be in all 50 states, we're creating extremely handcrafted, rare, exquisite. Um, we make 55 different products up there, and all of them in very small batches, and they come out when they come out. So, for instance, we make a blackberry trumpet, a black trumpet mushroom blueberry liqueur. Um, and we only make it when it's blueberry season and black trumpet mushroom season. Um, we make we make seasonal an apiary gin, um, and it only comes out when the spruce tips are in season. Um, and we're selling our whiskeys, even though they're only that the oldest we have is 7 years old. We make everything from scratch there too. Miller on grain, all the it's all the tropes about craft distilling, but we actually do it for real. I think we make all of our own neutral grain spirit. We make everything from scratch, and our whiskey program is our Old Man of the Mountain whiskey is I think easily one of the best bourbons in the country. Although we don't know because we don't enter award shows. Um, but we I wouldn't say we get away with selling it for a super premium, but we're selling our whiskeys. Sometimes the bottles go for 100, $250. Um, so the goal isn't to expand and get venture capital money and to become the next, Diageo. The goal is to have this really brilliant gem that grows exponential, that grows, step by step the proper way. We just bought another 105 acres up there because we maxed out the current distillery, and we're about to build a another on that 105 acres. We're about to build another continuous still, and and then we have a whole like composting program. We have a whole it's very sustainable. All that stuff. It, it, so that's the goal. The goal is to not make. What I mean by Hermes is like I don't want to be the biggest distillery in the world. I want to be the best,
Mm-hmm.
and I want it to grow for generations. My daughter, who's 21, graduates from St. John's College in Annapolis, and her goal is to take over the business. She wants to go to Scotland when she graduates and work in a whiskey distillery so she can bring learn what they have to learn and bring it home. Um, but yeah, that's how we want to emulate Hermes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Controlling a small little corner of the market by being, to your
The
point the
best,
whole time, like, yeah, the best in your own little corner of the world. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and not necessarily. It's interesting too because we have a lot of great clients, and it's interesting that the biggest companies are all still family owned. Like Gallo's a client of ours, and Ernest Gallo Jr. Has become a good friend of mine, and he came to the distillery and he said that the mistake most craft distillers make is they expand their distribution too fast. And he said, you know, the, don't make that mistake. And it's interesting because we had tried expanding to New York, Boston right from the get go, and we had plans to go, get listed. And it really made us pause and rethink like, no, we should own the state of New Hampshire. And once we own the state of New Hampshire, which we do now, once we own the state of New Hampshire, we will selectively grow from there. And I think I'm inspired again through history and learning of generational family businesses. That's why I love the whiskey, the distilling business. It's the only one of the few businesses out there that still run that way,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's really a noble. I'm not. It's interesting. I know we weren't going to talk about politics, but there's a reason we're in New Hampshire with a distillery. One is water. Um, we're sitting on top of the best aquifer on the entire East Coast. Two is my family's from New Hampshire, going back to 1637. They were one of the first settlers there. And three, live free or die, motherfucker. I'm pretty hardcore libertarian. Um, and I just love that, you know, so I'm not anti-capitalist. I am anti-enlightenment, I have to say. I feel that capitalism, like, is cancer, and that growing for the sake of growth is a tumor on the world. And what you need to do is not just sustain, but create beauty and create enchantment and joy in the world. And that's the goal. And I realize, like, I know a lot of us are just trying to get by, and it's some rich dude telling you to create beauty is like, fuck you. But no, what it means is make conscious choices and make choose beauty, choose to make things in the world that you're proud of and that you can, you know, pass it down to your kids and say, look what I made. I don't know.
It has been more of my own uh awakening to kind of stepping away from what does the research say and like this whole progression towards scale. And so yeah, like part of the reason the book resonated with me is recognizing that there was a big part of that piece of me for a long time that did exist. And this idea of, yeah, doing beautiful things for people you care about that you enjoy sure sounds like a whole lot more fun than just biding your time, getting along with everybody. Yeah, like finding something that kind of gets you riled up makes sense. And, I guess one of my like other takeaways that has kind of come to better to fruition as I think about what am I trying to do. I remember you used this line when we were working with Guinness. You said, what was it? You guys need to become brewers again, not just marketers. And how often are we all just like re-trumpeting the brand as opposed to like falling back into the craft that kind of
Well, again, that goes to that Guinness is a great example of that. Yeah, I remember when we told them you need to become brewers again, not marketers. They were kind of gobsmacked at the beginning. What do you mean? We make the best commercials in the world. I'm like, yeah, you do, but you also make the original craft beer, and you have such a storied history, and you make great liquid. You need to talk about all of it, and we need to get people thinking about that again. And that's why we built the Open Gate Brewery in Dublin first, and then we built a bigger one in Maryland. And our work with Guinness is going on 7 years now, and um, hey, their sales are up double digits every year since we started with them. So it's yeah. So I feel like in everything you do, like and I don't want to make it sound like what we work with big companies and their job is shareholders and scale. We get that. And there's a famous artist that I worked with years ago named Doug Aiken, and he had we worked on a video for him with him for MTV, and he came in and he had two portfolios. One was called bread and one was called butter. And the bread portfolio was work he did for money, and the butter portfolio was work he did for art. And I that always stuck with me, and I always feel like um, you need to have bread and butter, and if you do it right, eventually the butter pays for everything. But you got to keep an eye, like they bread and butter needs to intersect as a Venn diagram. And sometimes, you know, it's also weird too. Like, here's the guy telling you to create beauty, and yet I sold cigarettes for 20 years, right? Um, Yet if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be in a position where I could do what I'm doing now. So I don't know. And again, like I always thought, as a student of American history, and I always thought tobacco was a cool category, but they fucked it up royally themselves. But anyway, enough about that.
Well, yeah, but I think you certainly showed that you brought some edginess to it as well. What was it? The Red Camel line was
Red Camel.
yeah, it's like
Yeah.
back because only because it tastes good, which is like yeah, it's fun stuff there.
Wait. I'm gonna tell you,
Yeah, yeah,
funny.
yeah.
My wife is 9 years younger than me, and when we first met, she was like, "Oh my God, you did those Red Camel ads. They were all over my college dorm, along with diesel ads." And I was like, "Oh, that's so great." I mean, it's great. It was terrible, but it's great because it was kind of like, "Oh, we were one of those." And when we created Red Camel, back when magazines were still a big deal, I remember I said, "I want our brand to have as much buzz, and sit at the front of the magazine of interview or paper, right there with Diesel." And I'm trying to think what other big brands were, but Diesel was the brand I was trying to catch. And I think we did. So there you go.
It's you certainly you made it into you were the Metallica poster she was hanging on her
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And having points with her sounds like probably a pretty good idea. So I know you spend a ton of time on social, but for people out there, one, the book Brand Mysticism is obviously coming out, but in terms of keeping up with your work, Stephen, as well as the book, anything you want people to, any places they should look to find that, what do you want to share
Oh,
before we sign off?
okay, a couple of things. So I am on social media. I just don't obsess over it.
Fair
So
enough.
you can actually follow me. I think it's my name, Steve Grass.
Hmm.
But I was going to say, so the book, we launched a whiskey based on teachings from the book, and the brand is called Dunce. Dunce Whiskey is just launching, and Dunce Whiskey is genius because in the book we talk about how all these bourbon brands have fake stories. Um, what's the one? Templeton is the most
Yep.
notorious.
Yep.
So there's a graphic in the book with a dunce cap floating over a whiskey glass, and I just thought that would be such a great brand. So we created Dunce to troll the whiskey industry, but then we found out this amazing story about the origins of the dunce cap. And the origins of the dunce cap were, there was this guy, John Duns, in the 13th century, who when he lived was considered the smartest man alive. And he wore a conical hat that he believed brought brought the energy from the divine energy from the heavens into his skull through the point. Pyramid power, conical power. And he had a group of followers called Dunsmen. And the Pope got jealous of John Duns because everyone thought he was smarter than the Pope. So what did the Pope do? He buried him alive. And the Pope started a campaign to make the dunce cap, or to make John Duns, a symbol of stupidity as opposed to the smartest man in the world. So over the centuries, the dunce cap became a symbol of stupidity. So we thought it'd be really great or fun to call the brand Dunce, but then also use giant dunce caps, cones, and we put them over the whiskey barrels, and to see if it would actually help the taste of the whiskey. And you be the judge. It's amazing. So our point is that if you believe that Templeton rye was actually drunk by Al Capone, why wouldn't you believe that a giant dunce cap resting on a whiskey barrel would transform the taste of the whiskey? So that's the point. And Dunce whiskey is actually available on sealbach.com. But you can also buy it at the distillery. in Tamworth, and you can also buy it at Art and the Age in Philadelphia, which is our bottle shop and cocktail bar. And you can follow Dunce Whiskey on Instagram. And we did a great documentary on John Duns and the giant Dunce caps, which we did for real. We really did do the Dunce caps, rested them on the whiskey barrels, and I don't know, it's fun. It's a lot of fun.
I believe you did it. Based on everything else I've read, I trust in that for sure.
But that's a great mystical story, right? Come on, Dunce Whiskey, and it's a great call, right? And what we're doing is we're giving away Dunce caps with every bottle, and every bar that we sell it into, all the bartenders are going to get Dunce caps. So I don't know.
Love it. Closing with a good story. Yeah, Stephen, thanks so much for taking time to chat today. This was a lot of fun.
Great, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
You betcha. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. The show notes for today's episode are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. If you'd like to keep up with what we're working on, there are 2 great ways to do so. One, our short weekly newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, which you can sign up for at decodingcocktails.com/newsletter, or give us a follow on Instagram at Decoding Cocktails. If you think this podcast is great stuff, we'd love it if you'd subscribe or, of course, share an episode with a friend. The Decoding Cocktails podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon, and happy cocktailing.